I want to think about how we influence policy. And I want to present to you a thought experiment, which I call a kind of model of policy influence that summarizes the way that I think about policy influence and present what I think recent evidence implies for that model, and hopefully provide you some motivation for why we should think about this subject today. So let's think of policy as frontline decisions, decision points that public officials have to make. And these decision points are typically embedded inside a program of activity in public service. These programs inside sectors like health and education, and those inside government administration. And so for me, when I think about public policy, I think of the scale of public policy, the scale of these decision points, as relative to the scale of government. So how big is public policy? How big is government? Well, there are about 500,000 local governments in the world, something like 183 national, various regional, like 2,000 state and province. So now let's think. In each of these governments, there's something like 10 sectors: health, education, water, and so forth. And back of the envelope, very rough approximation, in each of those sectors, there's probably 10 programs. You can think of them 10 budget line items. And for each of those programs, there's 10 decision points. Which village should I operate in? What kind of technology should I use to drill a borehole? What timing should I have? Just summing all this up means that every year in the budget, there's something like 500 million budget decisions per year. That's the policy we're trying to influence. This is a rather daunting number to me. I don't know how many public policy decisions you've influenced in your life, but to me, this is just an amazing amount of public policy to influence. And of course, some work influences multiple decisions at one time. But given the need for validity of any research for a particular context or decision point, it's still a very substantial number. So as an empirically founded institution, what we want to know is a little bit about the elasticities of the nodes at different points in this model. Where can you have impact? And so we could invest in decision points. We could spend our time trying to work out which way we should go on a specific decision. Or we could say, well, we want to take a holistic approach to a decision point and understand how to operate a program. And then, of course, one could think, well, let's invest in a sector. Work out how to get health going. But as soon as you start working with an entire sector, you're into issues of administration, of how to run the personnel and the organization of these programs. And so you're into issues of whole of government. My big question is, how do we affect these different nodes? How much does an investment actually have influence? And so let's start with the classic decision points. This is actually quite hard, even though we all work on how to improve the decisions of public policymakers. What is an average effect that we should expect? At Dime, we've tried to assess the portfolio of IEs that we've done. And our sense is that a good aspirational number is something like doubling the effectiveness of a decision point. That's the kind of big number. Now, you know, many evaluations don't get something this large, and there are a few outliers, but there's something aspirational about this, and we have been able to do this in quite a number of IEs. In preparation for this talk, I looked at the documents underlying another big assessment of development effectiveness, the Copenhagen Consensus, and that number, the idea of doubling, is broadly in line with some of the elements of the Copenhagen Consensus. And then if you spend your time looking through the JPEL RCT database, this idea that you can double development effectiveness is not too far from the truth for a body of evidence. So if that's what you can do with a decision point, what about the administration above it? Because in my model, all policy is embedded inside an administration. So I can now show you evidence from a range of settings on that, but I want to start with the graph I showed you at the end of my first policy research talk. These are slides from that talk, and the idea that came across is that bureaucracy is fundamentally diverse. And actually, one of the stylized facts, I'd say, of public administration empirical work over the last 4 or 5 years is that that is true. That bureaucracy is just a very diverse place. Some things work very well, some things fail. And when you start to think about this, this is ex post kind of obvious. there are a few systematic forces driving homogeneity in the public service. And so if bureaucracy is fundamentally diverse, if the administrative setting is such, what does that mean for influencing policy? Well, let me take you back to the graph in Ghana that I showed at the end of my last graph. What this shows us is the 35 core public institutions of Ghanaia's civil service. These are the ministries that we've worked with. And they rank our data collection over 3 years of how many tasks that they were supposed to complete that they completed. So the y-axis is the proportion completed, and just to be clear, those underneath the graph, those underneath the dots are completed tasks, those above are uncompleted tasks. Ghana is in the middle of government effectiveness on the WGI for a lot of the kind of clients that we work with. This is not unusual, but the first thing you think is, wow, that is a lot of uncompleted tasks. And of course, the first thing that I think when I see that is that the average investment in a good decision, a good design of a point, is going to be heavily mediated depending on where you are in that distribution, which ministry you're working with. So even if you're working with any but the very best organization in Ghana, you immediately lose 40% of your development impact if you haven't worked with the administrative environment. Just because you weren't thinking about that parallel infrastructure for planning. And if you work with an organization in the bottom 75% of performers, you lost all of the gains in development finance that arises from better design, because you're losing 50% of the tasks that are supposed to be completed. The next graph I showed you was not just the organizations, but stacked on the solid dots, which are the ministries, are the units inside those ministries. And what you see is incredible variation within the same organization. So let's take a ministry about in the middle of the distribution and see the 3 units that are on this dotted line. What you find is that if you're lucky and your program or your decision point, the thing that you've been working on, is on the right side of the corridor, that unit that gets things done, and that's the 0.8%. Over 3 years, 80% of tasks were completed. But what if you're unlucky? What if when you mentor that ministry and you turn left, the unit you're working with is on the left-hand side of the corridor? Well, you're down at that 10 percentage point. You've lost 90% of your development effectiveness because you're working with the unit on the left side of the corridor. And what about the one at the end of the corridor? That over 3 years produced nothing. To me, this motivates immensely the idea that thinking about public policy isn't just about good design of decision points. It's about trying to work with that unit or trying to raise these units further up this dotted line. And as I said, is this a Ghana phenomenon? Absolutely not. Now, this is some data from myself, from my co-authors, from my friends, from people in the community. We now know that this 0 to 100% distribution across ministries, departments, and agencies is everywhere. Everywhere. And so let me take you one more step along this journey and say, let me take you to Slovakia, where we've been working on productivity data, and we even have data at the individual level. So let me take 2 tasks. So this task is business licensing. And what you see here is a graph of caseload, the amount of cases that an individual officer was able to throughput in a month. And this is over a multi-year period, so these are pretty good sense of how productive these individuals are. And once again, those orange triangles show you the organization, the district average. Huge amounts of variation across districts, but even more amongst individuals. And this is true across all the different types of tasks that we look at. On the right is environmental regulation. People, officers looking at cases of environmental regulation. So in Slovakia, now it's not just turning to the right unit in the right organization, it's turning to the right person. The public administrator is going to hugely mediate your capacity to convert better decision points into development impact. And so when I think about this model, I think to myself, well, then surely we should be working on how public administration works, as well as working on the good design of individual projects, individual decision points within those projects. But I also think about the scale. 500 million decision points a year. How are we going to affect that? Working on individual decision points is going to be tough to influence policy writ large. But if we influence the machine that defines those decision points, maybe we have more of a chance. It was interesting to hear Esther Duflo's reflections 2 weeks ago at the Dime Impact Week, when she said, summarizing her entire body of experience and work, that what matters enormously in generating successful development impacts and knowledge are the details of implementation that no one can think of in advance. And they are solved in partnership with our often government partners. And we also all knew this. Anyone who's ever tried to implement a project or program in the field knows if you get the right field coordinator, manager, individual public official that you're working with, everything goes right. But if you get the wrong one, you never do the evaluation, you never roll out that project, the operation doesn't work. But we know this, and yet it is not at the center of how the bank works, nor at the research that we do. If public administration is so mediating, and here's all the data to show it, then surely it should be something we take very seriously.